Every great moment in history has a turning point, a decision, a mistake, a storm, a delay. And at that point, history splits into two paths. One was lived, the other never was. But that second path, the one that never happened, sometimes tells us more than the one that did. So far on this channel, we've covered the most critical battles of World War II, the ones that actually happened. Now, we're opening a different door. The other side of history. The other side of history. In this series, we focus on a single question, a series of speculative scenarios based on historians' real analyses, yet entirely respectful of history. And our first question today is this. December 1941. German tanks were just 15 kilometers from Moscow. The Soviet defense was crumbling. Stalin was considering evacuating the city. What happened next? Or what if it hadn't? June 22, 1941. Germany attacked the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa began, the largest land campaign in history. In the first few months, the Germans advanced at an incredible pace. Minsk fell. Kiev fell. Leningrad was besieged. Millions of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. In October 1941, the final major offensive toward Moscow began. Its name, Operation Typhoon. By the end of November, German troops had advanced to within 15 kilometers of Moscow. They could see the buildings from outside the city. Stalin's plans were in place. Moscow would be evacuated if necessary. But then two things happened. First, winter. The German troops were unprepared for winter warfare. Their equipment froze. The soldiers froze. Supply lines were cut off. Second, Siberia. Stalin's spies reported that Japan would not attack the Soviets. With this information, Stalin moved fresh divisions from Siberia to Moscow. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began. The Germans were pushed back. Moscow did not fall. Now let's ask that question. What if the Germans hadn't stopped? What if Moscow had fallen? Let's look at the other side of history. The moment history was made, November 1941. German forces were 15 kilometers from Moscow. Tanks were advancing on the frozen road. The city's silhouette was visible on the horizon. A German officer turned his binoculars toward Moscow. He could see the buildings. Moscow today, victory tomorrow, he thought. But winter had other plans. But the German troops were unprepared for winter warfare. Their equipment froze. The tanks' engines wouldn't start. The soldiers were shivering in their summer uniforms. Supply lines were breaking down. Ammunition was running low. Fuel was nearly gone. Trains from Germany couldn't move on the frozen tracks. And just then, fresh divisions arrived from Siberia. Soldiers accustomed to winter warfare, fully equipped and strong in spirit. Moscow's last line of defense. But what if the Siberian divisions hadn't arrived? What if Stalin hadn't received that information? Then Moscow's only defenders would have been exhausted and demoralized troops. Or let's go back even further. What if the Germans had focused directly on Moscow instead of veering off into Ukraine? Hitler's generals were saying this. He didn't listen. October 1941. Before winter arrived, the ground hadn't frozen yet. The tanks were fully operational, and Moscow was just 60 kilometers away. The defensive lines are falling one by one. Soviet forces are forced to retreat. The defensive line is holding. German tanks are entering the first neighborhoods of Moscow. Civilians are fleeing. The enemy, who for years was said to never be able to reach us, was now on the streets. Stalin received the news during an emergency meeting at the Kremlin. The generals are silent, staring at the map. A decision had to be made. Immediately, the decision to evacuate was made. Stalin was boarding the armored train. He saw Red Square for the last time. The train headed east. Panic spread through the city. Moscow radio went silent. The people didn't know what was happening. The streets were in chaos. German advanced units were approaching the Kremlin walls. Searchlights illuminated the red brick walls. History held its breath. Red Square fell under German control. Another flag took the place of the Red Star. What did the world think when it saw this? When this news reached the Soviet soldiers at the front, the initial reaction was shock, then silence, then anger. There was no surrender. The war would continue from the east. Russia was vast. Beyond the Urals, the land was still Soviet territory. Moscow was important to the Soviets, but it wasn't everything. The factories in the Urals weren't stopping. Tanks were still being produced. The war wasn't over. The first domino had fallen. But this was only the beginning, because the fall of Moscow would trigger a series of reactions around the world. Alternative scenario. The first domino. Moscow had fallen. Stalin had fled to the east. So what was the first real impact? The Germans were celebrating. But the real question remained unanswered. Disintegration began among Soviet units on other fronts. Morale was plummeting. Commanders were struggling to keep their units together, but the Soviet army did not collapse. The chain of command remained intact. Zhukov was rallying his troops. Discipline hadn't broken down. Stalin continued to command from the Urals. The phones were working. Orders were being issued. The Soviets had not yet been defeated, but when the Germans took Moscow, the supply problem grew. The line stretching from Germany to Moscow was very long. It was getting a little harder every day. Advancing eastward was impossible. The distance required to reach the Ural Mountains was far beyond Germany's capacity, and the Soviet factories did not stop. Beyond the Urals, in places the Germans could not reach, tanks and artillery continued to be produced. America had also entered the war. Lend-Lease aid continued to reach the Soviets via the Pacific unstoppably. In the West, Britain was watching with concern. The maps on Churchill's desk had changed. His greatest ally had grown weaker. Voices calling for peace began to rise in Britain. Some asked, "The Soviets have been defeated. What's the point of continuing the war?" Churchill answered them with a single word: no. Churchill was holding out. Surrender was not in his vocabulary, and this resistance was critical to the war's continuation. Meanwhile, the United States was fighting Japan in the Pacific. It was seeking revenge for Pearl Harbor. This front would not change, even if Moscow fell. But the European strategy was under debate. If the Soviets were weakened, could the Europe First policy still hold? Roosevelt and Churchill were grappling with this question. Meanwhile, the Soviets were preparing for a major counteroffensive in 1942. Fresh troops from the Urals were pouring into the front. Moscow would be recaptured, and the German front was beginning to thin. The country was vast, the troops few. Holding the defensive line was growing more difficult by the day. The two-front war was crushing Germany. Britain in the west, the Soviets in the east, and soon North Africa and Italy would be added to the mix, and Stalingrad happened all over again. Even if Moscow had fallen, the Germans would have made the same mistake in Stalingrad, and they would have suffered the same catastrophe. Moscow had been taken, but Germany was still crumbling. Capturing a city was not enough to win the war, because the war was won in the factories, on the supply lines, and through human resolve. The dominoes kept falling, and this fall would always lead to the same place, just by a longer route. Domino effect. How would the world change? Moscow had fallen. So what did this change globally? The reverberations of this news were felt on every continent, on every front. Germany's power was at its peak, a vast empire stretching from France to Moscow. It looked magnificent, but the peak was also the beginning of the end. The advisors around Hitler were now speaking up. Paradoxically, the summit had emboldened some generals. But Hitler did not listen. Japan received the news in Tokyo. There was joy and a question. With the Soviets weakened, was this the best opportunity to seize Siberia? Would Japan have attacked Siberia? Historians are debating. Most likely, yes. The Soviet Union's weakness would have made it a very tempting target. This would have been devastating for the Soviets, the Germans in the West, the Japanese in the East, on two fronts at the same time. Withstanding such immense pressure would have been nearly impossible, but American aid would not stop. Lend-Lease ships would continue to arrive from the Pacific. This lifeline would not be cut off, and plans for Normandy were being made again. Perhaps a year late, perhaps with a different strategy, but a landing in France would happen again. Perhaps not in 1944, but in 1945. Perhaps on a smaller scale. But those shores would once again see Allied troops. But the cost of this delay was heavy. Every day that passed meant more people in the concentration camps. Every day that passed meant more losses. Millions more would lose their lives. This was not just a statistic. Behind every number was a name, a story, a family. The Manhattan Project was continuing. The atomic bomb would be developed again. Perhaps even faster. The prolonged war would accelerate the process. How realistic are these scenarios? Some are highly plausible, others are speculative, but all are based on an analysis of actual history. Historians are debating this. Ultimately, the Soviets regrouped. Fresh forces from the Urals poured westward, and the push to retake Moscow began. Moscow was recaptured. The red flag flew once more. The people were both rejoicing and weeping. The city was damaged, but still standing. Germany was retreating on both fronts. The Soviets in the east, the Allies in the west. The escape route was closing in. Berlin was preparing for its final battle. Perhaps not in 1945, but in 1946. But it was preparing. The end always came. Germany surrendered 2 years later, but with the same result, at the same table, with the same signature. This page of history remained unchanged. But what kind of world did this 2-year difference leave behind? More devastated, more exhausted, more losses, and the Soviets were much weaker. The Soviets emerged from the war weaker. This would reshape the Cold War. Perhaps shorter, perhaps more dangerous. America, however, emerged from the war stronger than ever. Its territory had never been bombed. Its industry had suffered no damage. The American century was beginning with far greater strength. The domino effect stopped, but the traces remained. In every corner of the world, the differences created by that 2-year delay were felt. 2 different paths, but the same destination. Perhaps that was history's greatest irony. What would the world look like today? So, what would the world look like today, in 2024? Some things would be the same, but some things would be very different. The Soviets would have emerged weaker from the war. This would have reduced their control over Eastern Europe. The Cold War might have lasted shorter, or the exact opposite. A weakened Soviet Union might have become a more aggressive one. The nuclear threat would have been brandished more loudly. Germany's collapse would have been more extensive. It would have meant a longer war and greater destruction. Reconstruction would have taken years longer. The European Union would have been established later, perhaps in the mid-1950s, perhaps as a smaller and weaker entity. If Japan had invaded Siberia, it would have faced a very different peace treaty. The American occupation would have taken a different form. Borders in the Middle East would have been drawn differently. A weakened Britain would have relinquished control of the region sooner. Today's map could have been very different. The United Nations would have been established later, and on a weaker foundation, because the world was more exhausted, more broken, and less hopeful. But some things would not have changed. America's global leadership, the dawn of the nuclear age, and the end of European colonialism, the outcome was the same. Only the path was longer and more painful. And that difference meant the lives of millions of people. The other side of history sometimes teaches us this. Even if everything changes, some things remain the same. Human resolve is at the top of that list. What do historians think about this scenario? Most historians agree on this point. The fall of Moscow would not have shortened the war. It would have prolonged it. Because the Soviets were not a state that would surrender. They would have retreated eastward, continued production, and launched a counteroffensive. Renowned historian John Keegan emphasizes this point. The fall of Moscow would have been symbolically devastating, but it would have had only a limited impact on the Soviets' capacity to fight. The Soviet industrial infrastructure had been moved beyond the Urals and was safe. Another key point: Hitler's real mistake was not Moscow, but Stalingrad. Even if Moscow had been captured, the Stalingrad blunder would still have occurred, and Stalingrad was the true turning point of the Eastern Front. So history tells us this: Moscow is a symbol. What determined the war was industrial capacity, supply lines, and human resolve. And in all three of these, the Soviets outpaced Germany. Whether Moscow fell or not, what would have happened if Hitler had taken Moscow? The war would have dragged on. More blood would have been shed, but the outcome would have been the same. Because what was decisive on this page of history was not the capture of a city. What was decisive was the resolve of the people. And the resolve of the Soviet people could not be broken by any territorial loss. The other side of history sometimes reveals the truth more clearly. Moscow did not fall, but even if it had, history would have reached the same destination, just through a slower and more painful path. If you want to keep exploring the other side of history, subscribe to our channel. Our next question takes us to a much darker place. What if the Normandy landings had failed?